Welcome to Americana Archives. Today's headline is Workings of the UGRR, Underground Railroad that helped fugitives to escape. The subheadline says, Recent death of one of the famous conductors recalls the operations of the system. This article originally came from the San Francisco Chronicle. It says, in the little town of Marysville, Ohio, there died on August 26th, at the age of 92 years, William Craddy, who was known as one of the most notable conductors of the Underground Railroad for the assistance of escaping slaves during anti-slavery times. Mr. Craddy is said to have helped over 3,000 slaves to escape to Canada, and at one time, a reward of $3,000 was offered to anyone who would deliver him alive or dead south of Mason and Dixon's line. Slavery in this country is a thing of the past, and today there are few living who took part in the heroic events which led up to its abolition. When William Lloyd Garrison founded the anti-slavery movement, there were many who enrolled themselves under his flag, but their numbers were few compared to the many who upheld the pernicious system of human chattels. And the founders of the new crusade for liberty for the black as well as the white met the bitterest of fanatical opposition. Yet despite their persecution, the abolitionists persevered, their recruits coming in from all states, men and women of all classes, braving the hostility of their neighbors, relatives, and friends. The agitation for the freedom of the blacks gave rise to the formation of one of the most remarkable secret organizations which has ever existed in this or any other country, and the name of the Underground Railroad will always be identified with those of the noble men and women who suffered indignity, insult, and imprisonment in the cause of the liberation of the slaves. The Underground Railroad could scarcely be called an organization, for unlike other societies, it did not print its reports. It was not planned or organized by one man or even a few, but grew up gradually as a result of the workings of the Abolition Party. Its sole object was that of helping the slaves to escape from the southern states to Canada. This was not an easy matter, for at that time laws existed which required each state to surrender fugitive slaves to their masters. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it the duty of officers of the United States to enforce the law. The entire machinery of the federal government could be called upon by a slave owner to capture and return to him as human property. And it was in the face of this law that many men and women banded themselves together as members of the Underground Railroad organization to help the hunted blacks to reach Canada. The reputed president of the Underground Railroad was Levi Coffin of the Society of Friends, or Quakers. His ancestors came from England in 1642 and settled at Salisbury in Massachusetts. Levi Coffin was born in 1798 in North Carolina, and it's said of him that when only 7 years old, he remarked to his father on seeing some fugitive slaves chained together that when he grew old enough, he would help the poor slaves to escape. Coffin as a liberator. He began his work as a liberator early in life. When 15 years old, he helped a slave to escape who had been captured near Baltimore and brought back to North Carolina. He often helped runaway slaves who concealed themselves in the daytime in the woods near his father's house by taking food to their hiding place. It was just such acts as these which gave rise to the Underground Railroad, a system which extended over the entire country, and which acted in a silent but effective way in defiance of the mandates of the Fugitive Slave Law. Certain parties thus came to be known as the Friends of the Fugitives, and the location of their houses led to the formation of routes, by which the escaping slave could safely make his way to freedom. These routes, in the secret language of the UGRR, Underground Railroad, were known as lines, and the houses were called stations. In course of time, the lines were so well organized that in every town along the route, there was a director who had at his command a number of hiding places for slaves, funds collected for their relief, wagons for passing them on by night to the next station, and means of acquiring information as to any pursuit. Levi Coffin had a large oil factory in Newport, Indiana, and the three principal lines from the south converged at his house, one from Cincinnati, one from Madison, and one from Jeffersonville, Indiana. Teams and wagons were always kept in readiness, and the journey made by night along roads and byways seldom used. Every precaution to evade pursuit had to be taken, as the manhunters were often on the track, sometimes ahead of the slaves. There was no lack of passengers on the road, and the conductors never knew at what minute of the day or night they might be called upon to take charge of a train. A gentle tap on the door at night was the signal of the arrival of the fugitives, and instantly the door would be opened. In the cold and rain, there would be a wagon load of fugitives, men, women, and children. The conductor piloted them for 10, 20, or 30 miles on their perilous journey. After a few short hours of rest, they would be conveyed by a conductor to another station, and thus from station to station, the journey to freedom would be continued. the hapless fugitives never knowing at what minute they might be overtaken and captured, and their white friends punished for aiding and abetting their attempt to escape from bondage. It was not only in the rural districts that the stations existed. They flourished also in the cities, and one of the most important of them was in the city of Cincinnati, on the very border of the slave state of Kentucky. The conductors of the Underground Railroad asked no compensation for the fugitive slaves' passage to the Inn of Freedom, as Canada was called. Slave hunters baffled. Isaac Hooper, another prominent Quaker, was one of the well-known managers of the road, and time and again, Coffin and Hooper baffled the officers of the law, starting their train under the very eyes of the slave hunters. On one occasion, a party of 40 slaves reached Cincinnati, which was the most important station on the Underground route, and the police were on the alert to capture them. Hooper and Coffin dressed the men as women and the women as men, put them in carriages with smartly dressed drivers, and drove them out of town in various directions. The officers thought that the carriages contained a wedding party, and never suspected that the men and women were the fugitives they were looking for. At another time, the officers were thrown off the track by being allowed to capture a well-known abolitionist and a number of free black people, the real culprits easily getting out of the way while the police were busy with the new arrests. The lines of the Underground Railroad extended in all directions, and a perfect network of secret routes existed. Men and women of all classes belonged to the organization. The farmer loaned his cart, and the capitalist his money. Women gave clothes and food, and even children helped the cause by giving to their hapless little friends toys and playthings. The strictest secrecy had to be maintained, and a conductor only knew the one from whom he received his train and the one to whom he delivered it for passage along the road. Travel by steam railroads and communication by telegraph was in its infancy in the early days of the slave stealers, and it was possible for a party of men to travel hundreds of miles before a hue and cry was raised. Thousands of fugitive slaves were enabled to reach Canada by the Underground Railroad and thus gain their liberty. Rundle Palmer was another famous conductor in Indiana, and though he was closely watched by the authorities, he succeeded in passing his freight to the next station for many years without being caught in the act. Jacob Heaton of Salem sheltered hundreds of fugitives at his tavern, and despite the efforts of the officers, succeeded in baffling them time out of number. Hundreds of men and women whose names have passed into oblivion helped thousands of slaves to escape, and posterity does not even know their names to honor them. John Brown was only a lad when escaping slaves began to appear in the North. The story of the fugitives touched him and inspired him to serve the suffering race. He also joined the Underground Railroad and helped many slaves to escape, until his career was cut short by his memorable raid at Harper's Ferry. Daring Southern agents. In the South, the Underground Railroad was looked upon as a lawless and contemptible conspiracy. Those who belonged to it were called slave stealers, and their fate was sealed if caught red-handed in the crime of assisting slaves to escape. Many men met their death in the dense forests of the South while engaged in the good cause, and no monument marks their resting place, nor are they honored in story or song. A noted conductor in the South, whose name was hated by the slave owners and upon whose head a price was fixed, was John Fairchild. He was of a different type to the men who ran trains in the North. Fairchild was a Virginian, without family, fond of adventure and excitement. He was always ready to accept money from the slaves, and as ready to spend it. But if they had no money, he was always ready to assist them to reach the North. He enlisted the services of a number of determined men, and with them he went all over the slave states. He never hesitated to fight when pursued, and it was more by bravado than cunning that he was enabled to reach stations on the road, where there was little fear of pursuit. He helped thousands of slaves to get to the North, where they were passed on to Canada. In 1861, he was detected arming the slaves of Tennessee and was lynched by an enraged Southern mob. The conductors never knew from what part of the country their trains came. They were simply passed along the line to the next station. No record was ever kept of the number of slaves who succeeded in reaching Canada. Many would be captured soon after leaving their owner's home, while others would be snatched away from the goal of liberty when it was almost in sight. The close of the Civil War and the emancipation of the slave in the United States put an end to the work which for 30 years had been so nobly carried on by the Underground Railroad. After the war, Levi Coffin called a meeting in Cincinnati of the conductors of the road. The meeting was a remarkable one, for many intimate friends found for the first time that they had been working for the same cause. Levi Coffin, in his address, said that he had borne the mysterious office of president of the Underground Railroad for 30 years, that the slave hunters had given him the title because they could never find their slaves when once they had passed into his hands, but that since the United States had taken up the work of emancipation, The Underground Railroad had found that its stock had gone down in the market, the business was spoiled, the road was of no further use, and he declared its operations at an end. This story came from the great state of Indiana, being reported in the Sunday Journal of September 12, 1897. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.